Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Darius Dotch, MLK Sapp, and T. Michael Rambo of Penumbra Theater.
Why, we thank you so very much. Thank you for that introduction, Ms. Maya Sullivan. Chisay Colson is, I don't know if she's here, but we want to thank her and Maya both for being such gracious a host for this evening's conversation. My name is T. Michael Rambo, and we're here from Penumbra Theater Company. Penumbra is the oldest and longest standing African-American theater company, an equity house located in a community that speaks to and addresses concerns of the community from which it has sprouted some 40 years ago. And so we're so delighted this evening that we get a chance to share with you and to follow up and continue the conversation that began earlier in the Great Hall. What you'll hear this evening are a great number of excerpts, 3 excerpts to be exact, from Dr. King's earlier speeches, from my friend, once again, MLK Sapp and Darius Dotch. These 2 gentlemen are going to do, as I mentioned, excerpts discussing Dr. King's legacy, the ideals of equity, understanding community, and acceptance. Now, most people know the I Have a Dream speech, of course, and in knowing that, it celebrates its eloquence and its inspiration. But Dr. King was very brave and provocative, too. Today, we'll share some of the other beautiful speeches and sermons, just portions of them that he gave at vital moments of our nations, so that we can get a better sense of the man, his legacy, and highlight tonight's versions of these speeches will be 1, Beyond Vietnam, A Time to Break Silence, an anti-Vietnam War and pro-social justice speech delivered by Dr. King exactly 1 year before he was assassinated. Give Us the Ballot, shared by Dr. King in 1957, just a couple of years past the Montgomery bus boycott. It's advocating the voting rights for African Americans in the U.S. And lastly, an excerpt, a eulogy, delivered at the funeral of the 3 of the 4 girls who died in the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing in 1963. So to begin things, we're going to start off with Mr. Darius Dotch, who will be delivering the Beyond Vietnam speech, A Time to Break Silence.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, I come to this magnificent house of worship tonight because my conscience leaves me no other choice. I join you in this meeting because I am in deepest agreement with the aims and work of the organization that brought us together, clergy and laymen concerned about Vietnam. The recent statements of your executive committee are the sentiments of my own heart, and I found myself in full accord when I read its opening lines. A time comes when silence is betrayal. That time has come for us in relation to Vietnam. The truth of these words is beyond doubt, but the mission to which they call us is most difficult one. Even when pressed by the demands of inner truth, men do not easily assume the task of opposing their government's policy, especially in a time of war. Nor does the human spirit move without great difficulty against all the apathy of conformists within one's own bosom and the surrounding world. But we must move on. Some of us who have already begun to break the silence of the night have found that the calling to speak is often a vocation of agony, but we must speak. We must speak with all the humility that is appropriate to our limited vision, but we must speak. And we must rejoice as well. For surely this is the time in our nation's history that a significant number of its religious leaders have chosen to move beyond the prophesying of smooth patriotism to the right grounds of a firm dissent based upon the mandates of conscience and the reading of history. Perhaps a new spirit is rising among us. If it is, let us trace its movement and pray that our inner being may be sensitive to its guidance, for we are deeply in need of a new way beyond the darkness that seems so close around us. Over the past 2 years, as I have moved to break the betrayal of my own silences and to speak from the burnings of my own heart, as I have called for radical departures from the destruction of Vietnam, many persons have questioned me about the wisdom of my path. At the heart of their concerns, this query has often loomed large and loud. Why are you speaking about the war, Dr. King? Why are you joining the voices of dissent? Peace and civil rights don't mix, they say. Aren't you hurting the cause of your people, they ask? And when I hear them, though I often understand the source of their concern, I am nevertheless greatly saddened, for such questions mean that inquirers have not really known me, my commitment, or my calling. Indeed, their questions suggest that they do not know the world in which they live in. It is in the light of such tragic misunderstanding, I deem it of signal importance of state clearly. And I trust concisely why I believe that the path from Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, the church in Montgomery, Alabama, where I began my pastorate, leads clearly to this sanctuary tonight. I come to this platform tonight to make a passionate plea to my beloved nation. A few years ago, it seemed as if there was a real promise of hope for the poor, both black and white, through the poverty program. Then came the buildup in Vietnam, and I watched this program broken and eviscerated as if it were some idle political plaything on a society gone mad on war. And I knew that America would never invest the necessary funds or energies in rehabilitation of its poor so long as adventures like Vietnam continue to draw men and skills and money like some demonic, destructive suction tube. Perhaps a more tragic recognition of reality took place when it became clear to me that the war was doing far more than devastating the hopes of the poor at home. It was sending their sons and their brothers and their husbands to fight and die in extraordinarily high proportions relative to the rest of the population. We were taking the black young men who had been crippled by our society and sending them 8,000 miles away to guarantee liberties in South Asia, which they had not found in Southwest Georgia and East Harlem. So we have been repeatedly faced with the cruel irony of watching Negro and white boys on TV screens as they kill and die together for a nation that has been unable to seat them together in the same schools. So we watch them in brutal solidarity, burning the huts of a poor village, but we realized that they would hardly live on the same block in Chicago. I could not be silent in the face of such cruel manipulation of the poor. As I have walked among the desperate, rejected, and angry young men, I have told them that Molotov cocktails and rifles will not solve their problems. I have tried to offer them my deepest compassion while maintaining my conviction that social change comes most meaningfully through nonviolent action. But they asked, and rightfully so, what about Vietnam? They asked if our own nation wasn't using massive doses of violence to solve its problems, to bring about the changes it wanted. Their questions hit home. And I knew that I could never again raise my voice against the violence of the oppressed in the ghettos without having first spoken clearly to the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government. For the sake of those boys, for the sake of this government, for the sake of the hundreds of thousands of trembling under our violence, I cannot be silent. In 1957, when a group of us formed the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, we chose as our motto, to save the soul of America. We were convinced that we could not limit our vision to certain rights for black people, but instead affirmed the conviction that America would never be free or saved from itself until the descendants of slaves were loosed completely from the shackles they still wear. And in a way, we are agreeing with Langston Hughes, that black bard of Harlem, who had written earlier, "Oh yes, I say it plain. America was never America to me, and yet I swear its oath, America will be." If America's soul becomes totally poisoned, part of the autopsy must read Vietnam. It can never be saved so long as it destroys the deepest hopes of men the world over. So it is that those of us who are yet determined that America will be are led down a path to protest and dissent, working for the health of our land. And as I ponder the madness of Vietnam and search within myself for ways to understand, I respond in compassion. My mind goes constantly to the people of that peninsula. They must see Americans as strange liberators. For 9 years following 1945, we denied the people of Vietnam the right of independence. For 9 years, we vigorously supported the French in their abortive effort to recolonize Vietnam. The only change come from America as we increased our troop commitments in support of governments which were singularly corrupt, inept, and without popular support. And all the while, the people read our leaflets and receive the regular promises of peace and democracy and land reform. Now, they languish under our bombs and consider us, not their fellow Vietnamese, the real enemy. They move sadly and apathetically as we herd them off the land of their fathers into concentration camps that where minimal social needs are not rarely met. They know they must move on or be destroyed by our bombs. So they go, primarily women and children and the aged. They watch as we poison their waters, as we kill 1 million acres of their crops. They must weep as the bulldozers roar through their areas, preparing to destroy the precious trees. They wander into the hospitals with at least 20 casualties from American firepower for 1 Viet Cong inflicted injury. So far, we may have killed 1 million of them, mostly children. They wander into the towns and see thousands of the children, homeless, without clothes, running in packs on the streets like animals. They see the children degraded by our soldiers as they beg for food. They see the children selling their sisters to our soldiers, soliciting for their mothers. What do these peasants think as we ally ourselves with the landlords and as we refuse to put any action into our many words concerning land reform? What do they think as we test our latest weapons on them, just as Germans tested out new medicine and new tortures in concentration camps in Europe? Where are the roots of the independent Vietnam we claim to be building? Is it among these voiceless ones? Now there is little left to build on, save bitterness. Soon the only solid physical foundations remaining will be found at our military bases and in the concrete of the concentration camps we call fortified hamlets. The peasants may well wonder if we plan to build our new Vietnam on such grounds as these. Could we blame them for such thoughts? We must speak for them and raise the questions they cannot raise. These too are our brothers. Here is the true meaning and value of compassion and nonviolence. When it helps us to see the enemy's point of view, to hear his questions, to know his assessment of ourselves. For from his view, we may indeed see the basic weakness of our own condition. And if we are mature, we may learn and grow and profit from the wisdom of the brothers who are called the opposition. And at this point, I should make it clear that while I have tried to give a voice to the voiceless in Vietnam and to understand the arguments of those who called enemy, I am deeply concerned about our own troops as anything else. For it concerns me that what we are submitting them to in Vietnam is not simply the brutalizing process that goes on in any war when armies face each other and seek and destroy. We are adding cynicism to the process of death. For they must know, after a short period of time there, that none of the things we claim to be fighting for are really involved. Before long, they must know that their government has sent them into a struggle amongst Vietnamese, and that the more sophisticated surely realize that we are on the side of the wealthy, the side of the secure, while we create a hell for the poor. Surely this madness must cease. We must stop now. I speak as a child of God and a brother of the suffering poor of Vietnam. I speak for those who are being subverted. I speak for the poor in America who are paying double price of smashed hopes at home and dealt death and corruption in Vietnam. I speak as a citizen of the world, for the world as it stands aghast at the path we have taken. I speak as one who loves America to the leaders of our own nation. The great initiative in this war is ours. The initiative to stop it must be ours. We are now faced with the fact, my friends, that tomorrow is today. We are confronted with the fierce urgency of now. In this unfolding conundrum of life and history, there is such a thing as being too late. Procrastination is still the thief of time. Life often leaves us standing bare, naked and dejected, with a lost opportunity. The tide in the affairs of men does not remain at flood, it ebbs. We may cry out desperately for time to pause in her passage, but time is adamant to every plea and rushes on. Over the bleached bones and jumbled residues of numerous civilizations are written the pathetic words, too late. We still have a choice today. Non-violent coexistence or violent co-annihilation. We must move past indecision to action. We must find new ways to speak for peace in Vietnam and justice throughout the developing world, a world that borders on our doors. Now, let us begin. Now let us redictate ourselves to the long and bitter but beautiful struggle of a new world. And if we only make the right choice, we will be able to transform this pending cosmic elegy into a creative psalm of peace. If we will make the right choice, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our world into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. If we will but make the right choice, we will be able to speed up the day, all of America and all over the world, when justice will roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. Thank you.
The fierce urgency of now. Thank you, Darius. Let's give Darius Dotch another round of applause. That was an excerpt from what was clearly a much larger and longer speech. And to think about it, perhaps I'd like to give the room a moment to breathe, because there was a lot of text that we just heard. And I see that many of us are sitting next to a neighbor, someone close to us. So if you take a moment and unpack what you just heard with someone who's sitting near you, and just listen to what their response to what you just heard, or there was an excerpt from that piece, a quote or a phrase that stood out for you. And just give you a few minutes just to talk amongst yourselves, and maybe you could turn back to someone who's close to you and have a conversation about what you just heard. As you're having this conversation, perhaps something might percolate up to the top for you. And if anyone would like to share some of the conversations or some of the thoughts that came from what we just heard, the fierce urgency of now, that stood out for me. Is there something that may have stood out for someone else who has just heard this excerpt from Dr. King about the Vietnam War? Do I hear a yes? Would anyone care to make a response to something that they heard or make a comment? Yes. I'll come up to you. I'm getting my steps in today. I have my little thing on there. All right. Do, 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 do.
So I think what stood me out, it was about the Vietnam War. I think this that is hurting their own people, and I think that happens quite often. And like, how can we stop it? Like, why are these people doing it? It's like he was saying, like your brothers, your neighbors, your family, and it's surprised me because we're sitting here while in Vietnam War there are other people fighting that they don't know each other, and yet it could be your neighbor, and then the next day they could be fighting a war just each other, and they probably don't even know the circumstances what they're fighting, but since they're in the military, they have to follow orders. I think that's sticking me out just the words of Vietnam War and just brothers, and I don't know, like.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Is it Stephanie?
Yes.
Thank you, Stephanie. Stephanie brings up a very valid point about war and how often there's a collateral damage, or those people who are harmed and impacted by war that have nothing to do with the circumstance that brought war about. And in your comment, you mentioned that it's really sad that people are pit against one another, and only to find out they aren't even familiar with or even aware of why they're fighting. And they're following orders and moving forward with things that are impacting and harming and killing and taking human life, which is a deplorable thing and something we still see today. Sadly, there's a lot of relevance to the Vietnam War and what we're experiencing on our planet, on our globe. Any other comments before we move on? Yes. I'm going to step right your way. I'm actually going to do the gentleman here and then come in. Matt? Here's the microphone here.
Oh, yeah, I was just going to comment that it's just interesting because King's opposition to the Vietnam War is rarely focused on, and I mean, it's brought up now and then, but that's something you kind of forget about because it's not talked about.
And as a matter of fact, Matt brings up a very good point. That's one of the things that kind of created some contention and some real challenges within the movement, was the fact that he departed from the issue about race and discrimination and issues of segregation and moved toward the Vietnam War, and that kind of came out of his beliefs around Buddhism and with Mahatma Gandhi.
Yeah, I guess I was just going to build on that just for a minute, that I think the connections that he makes between militarism and poverty and racism are very profound. And I think that's why in that last year, he only lived one more year after that. And I think that's when he became a real enemy of our government. And when they had called him a black messiah that must not be allowed to continue to live, when I've heard some of the documents of our government, I think that making those connections could have really led to a liberation movement that was very powerful, and he wasn't allowed to fulfill that.
Thank you for both of your comments. I think those are really valid and very profound in and of themselves, because there's a lot to be said about the impact of where he went and where he stood as it pertained to the Vietnam War. We're going to move on to the next reading that we have here that MLK Sapp is going to read for us. His piece is from 1957, and so he's going to talk about voting rights in this excerpt. And so once again, I'm going to ask you to be listening for parts of the reading that stand out for you, that resonate for you, or that connect to something that you feel is relevant for today. MLK Sapp.
Give us the ballot. Mr. Chairman, distinguished platform associates, fellow Americans, 3 years ago, the Supreme Court of this nation rendered in simple, eloquent, and unequivocal language a decision which will long be stenciled on the mental sheets of succeeding generations. For all men of goodwill, this May 17th decision came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of human captivity. It came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of the disinherited people throughout the world who had dared only to dream of freedom. Unfortunately, this noble and sublime decision has not gone without opposition. This opposition has often risen to ominous proportions. Many states have risen up in open defiance. The legislative halls of the South ring loud with such words as interposition and nullification. But even more, all types of conniving methods are still being used to prevent Negroes from becoming registered voters. The denial of this sacred right is a tragic betrayal of the highest mandates of our democratic tradition. And so our most urgent request to the President of the United States and every member of Congress is to give us the right to vote. Give us the ballot, and we will no longer have to worry the federal government about our basic rights. Give us the ballot, and we will no longer plead to the federal government for passage of an anti-lynching law. We will be the power of our vote, write the law on the statute, books of the South, and bring an end to the dastardly acts of the hooded perpetrators of violence. Give us the ballot, and we will transform the salient misdeeds of the bloodthirsty mobs into the calculated good deeds of orderly citizens. Give us the ballot, and we will fill our legislative halls with men of goodwill and send to the sacred halls of congressmen who will not sign a Southern manifesto because of their devotion to the manifesto of justice. Give us the ballot, and we will place judges on the benches of the South who would do justly and love mercy, and we will place at the head of the Southern states governors who have felt not only the tang of the human, but the glow of divine. Give us the ballot, and we will quietly and non-violently, without rancor or bitterness, implement the Supreme Court's decision of May 17, 1954. In this juncture of our nation's history, there is an urgent need for dedicated and courageous leadership. If we are to solve the problems ahead and make racial justice a reality, this leadership must be fourfold. First, there is need for strong, aggressive leadership from the federal government. So far, only the judicial branch of the government has evinced this quality of leadership. If the executive and legislative branches of the government were as concerned about the protection of our citizenship rights as the federal governments have been, then the transition from a segregated to an integrated society would be infinitely smoother. But we so often look to Washington in vain for this concern. In the midst of the tragic breakdown of law and order, the executive branch of the government is all too silent and apathetic. In the midst of the desperate need for civil rights legislation, the legislative branch of the government is all too stagnant and hypocritical. This dearth of positive leadership from the federal government is not confined to one particular political party. Both political parties have betrayed the cause of justice. The Democrats have portrayed it by capitulating the prejudices and undemocratic practices of the Southern Dixiecrats. The Republicans have portrayed it by capitulating to the blatant hypocrisy of right-wing, reactionary Northerners. These men so often have a high blood pressure of words and anemia of deeds. In the midst of these prevailing conditions, we come to Washington today pleading with the President and members of Congress to provide a strong moral and courageous leadership for a situation that cannot be permanently be evaded. The hour is late. The clock of destiny is ticking out. We must act now before it is too late. A second area is which there is need for strong leadership is from the white Northern liberals. There is a dire need today for a liberalism which is truly liberal. What we are witnessing today in so many Northern communities is a sort of quasi-liberalism which is based on the principle of looking sympathetically at all sides. It is a liberalism so bent on seeing all sides that it fails to become committed to either side. It is a liberalism that is so objectively analytical that it is not subjectively committed. It is a liberalism which is neither hot nor cold, but lukewarm. We call for a liberalism from the North which will be thoroughly committed to the ideal of racial justice and will not be deterred by the propaganda and subtle words of those who say, slow up for a while, you're pushing too fast. A third source that we must look to for strong leadership is from the moderates of the white South. It is unfortunate that at this time the leadership of the white South stems from the closed-minded reactionaries. These persons gain prominence and power by the dissemination of false ideas and by deliberately appealing to the deepest hate responses within the human mind. It is my firm belief that this closed-minded, reactionary, recalcitrant group constitutes a numerical minority. There are in the white South more open-minded moderates than appears on the surface. These persons are silent today because of fear of social, political, and economic reprisals. God grant that the white moderates of the South will rise up courageously without fear and take up the leadership in this tense period of transition. I cannot close without stressing the urgent need for the strong, courageous, and intelligent leadership from the Negro community. We need a leadership that is 1957 calm and yet positive. This is no day for the rabble-rouser, whether he be Negro or white. We must realize that we are grappling with the most weighty social problem of this nation, and in grappling with such a complex problem, there is no place for misguided emotionalism. We must work passionately and unrelentingly for the goal of freedom. But we must be sure that our hands are clean in the struggle. We must never struggle with falsehood, hate, or malice. We must never become bitter. I know how we feel sometimes. There is the danger that those of us who have been forced so long to stand amid the tragic midnight of oppression, those of us who have been trampled over, those of us who have been kicked about, there is the danger that we will become bitter. But if we become bitter and indulge in hate campaigns, the new order which is emerging will be nothing but a duplication of the old order. We must meet hate with love. We must meet physical force with soul force. There is still a voice crying out through the vista of time saying, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, pray for them that despitefully use you. Then and only then can you matriculate into the university of eternal life. That same voice cries out in terms lifted to cosmic proportions. He who lives by the sword will perish by the sword. And history is replete with the bleached bones of nations that failed to follow this command. We must follow nonviolence and love. I conclude by saying that each of us must keep faith in the future. Let us not despair. Let us realize that as we struggle for justice and freedom, we have cosmic companionship. There is something in our faith that says to us, never despair, never give up, never feel that cause of righteousness and justice is doomed. There is something in this universe which justifies Carlyle in saying, no lie can live forever. There is something in the universe which justifies William Cullen Bryant in saying, truth crushed to earth will rise again. There is something in this universe which justifies James Russell Lowell in saying, truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne. Yet that scaffold sways the future, And behind the dim unknown stands God within the shadow, keeping watch above his own. Go out with that faith today. Go back to your homes in the Southland to that faith, with that faith today. Go back to Philadelphia, to New York, to 1957 Detroit and Chicago with that faith today. That the universe is on our side in this struggle. Stand up for justice. Sometimes it gets hard, but it is always difficult to get out of Egypt, for the Red Sea always stands before you with discouraging dimensions. And even after you've crossed the Red Sea, you have to move through a wilderness with prodigious hilltops of evil and gigantic mountains of opposition. But I say to you this afternoon, keep moving. Let nothing slow you up. Thank you.
This piece about voters' rights is profound. Again, another opportunity for us to look at the fact that as we look at our climate today in this country, we're seeing more and more the realities of how African Americans, disenfranchised communities, those who are marginalized, are experiencing some of the same challenges of the 50s and the 60s around voter rights, about what is creating tension and areas of discourse around people who feel that they are not welcomed or invited to the table where it comes to the rights to vote and what that means and how that's impacting our political system and the nation's leadership. Are there any comments or anything that stood out in that piece that anyone would like to share that bubbled up for you? Yes. There's my friend Stephanie. All right now. Oh, there you go. Thanks, Adam.
So even here I noticed we're talking about 1950s, 1960s, where they were afraid and they were trying to tell them to never give up, not being afraid. And here until today, we're afraid to speak up. I think we haven't moved so much on, we haven't evolutionated so much on that fear, that voice. Like they were saying, you gotta vote, but sometimes it's not that you don't know the knowledge of it. Maybe you just don't wanna speak up because you're afraid of it, of your voice, to speak up for yourself. Maybe you're just that outstanding that maybe your voice is not enough. It just makes me think like never give up, never be afraid, and yet we still do it, and we're celebrating Martin Luther King, and we're not doing anything about it. Like how many years does it has to happen before you actually listen to his words and take action of it?
Thank you, Stephanie. Very, very well stated. The rhetoric gets to the point of at what point do we take his words and act upon them and really take the first steps? And the fact that people do stand in fear in many instances. Anyone else want to respond to what Stephanie may have commented, or how what she took away from that last excerpt that we heard, or any other things that may have come up for you? Yes. Thank you, Sandy.
Well, I was just struck by how unsparing he was in dividing up responsibility. Mm-hmm. So, for example, the weight that he put on Northern liberals, that just because you're a liberal doesn't mean that you get away with just a wishy-washy stand, that he had higher expectations of all sides. And the same thing when he was talking about in the Congress, that it wasn't just the Republicans, but it was the Dixiecrat Democrats. Right. He had everybody involved in sharing responsibility to see their part and to take action.
He spread the responsibility quite liberally, if you will. And it is kind of when he made the comment about high blood pressured words with anemic deeds. I think that was a great phrase. I think that's what it was, something to that extent. Yeah. Yes, right to your left there. Thank you.
Stephanie said, I always look at research and see if there's like improvement or not. And even though you don't really hear about it, there is a lot. There's more people of color that's in the Senate, in being governors, mayors, and more rate of people of color graduated from high school, college is going up. It's just they don't talk about it. They just only talk about. The only thing that they mostly show on the news is like the bad stuff of when black people getting shot and whatnot, and then that's what causes more fear on people. They're basically like, if you go up and do something, we're going to kill you. But in some cases, there's still a lot of powerful people in our day. It's just,
Yeah. Well, I appreciate one I'm going to make a leap of assumption here that there are a few years between us. I don't know. Call me crazy. I'm probably a little old, but I appreciate your observations and your calling us to the carpet in terms of how we view the advances that have taken place, and that there are more people of color and more women and people who are marginalized and disenfranchised and are of the people that Dr. King spoke of. And I think that that's a good point that you make, and I think that the media does have a tendency toward perpetuating stereotypes and belief systems that continue to keep people afraid of one another and concerned for their well-being or their piece of the pie. Does anyone else have a comment about what our young man may have said here? There's a woman back here to your left.
Hi. It puzzles me each year when we gather to celebrate Dr. King, and we constantly repeat his speeches and his words and his teachings. And sometimes we hear all of our leaders, we gather at these functions and talk about his work and his legacy and what he fought for. And people who can make those decisions or try to change things are the ones talking about his work, and we tend to not see that many change happening around us. But from today's speech, I was listening, and he talked about the violence where we can make change, we can do things without violence. But you look we come back to our own African American communities, and you hear about violence all around us. We are doing it, but we're celebrating him each year and all the time. So I don't know, but I'm thinking that it's about time, hundreds of years or many, many years later, that if we truly celebrate him, we need to start actually trying to do some of the things he really preached and some of the things he really wanted to happen for us in this day and age. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for calling us to task on walking the walk and talking the talk, and merging those in an active state. And I think that there are a broad range of intersections and points of entry into that conversation where people might say to the contrary, or not to dismiss or minimize your comment, but also to acknowledge that our modes of communication, whether it be media or within our families or within our neighborhoods, we're not seeing the progress and those acts that aren't negative. I think that there are many African-American males. I know my brother here, Tim Berry, has a program he does, Dr. Berry, who works around dispelling some of those myths, but also acknowledging that some of our myths are more true than myth as well. So I applaud you for, like I say, calling us to task. It's very important. In any closing remarks before we go into we've held you over in that we started a little late, but we really applaud and appreciate you for continuing to hold in here with us. And those who are in the warmer seats, just go like this. Oh no, it's all right. And we're going to move on to this last piece. This is a eulogy that Dr. King delivered after the loss of life of the 4 girls in the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing in September 13th, I think it was, in 1963, was shortly after the March on Washington, which made it even more compelling for so many. The eulogy for the young victims of the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing. This is an excerpt by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. September 18th, 1963, the 16th Street Baptist Church, Birmingham, Alabama, delivered at the funeral service for three of the children, Addie Mae Collins, Carol Denise McNair, Cynthia Diane Wesley, killed in that bombing. A separate service was held for the fourth victim, Carol Robertson. This afternoon, we gather in the quiet of this sanctuary to pay our last tribute of respect to these beautiful children of God. They entered the stage of history just a few years ago. In the brief years that they were privileged to act on this mortal stage, they played their parts exceedingly well. Now the curtain falls. They move through the exit. The drama of their earthly lives come to a close. They are now committed back to that eternity from which they came. These children, unoffending, innocent, and beautiful, were the victims of one of the most vicious and tragic crimes ever perpetrated against humanity. And yet, they died nobly. They are the martyred heroines of a holy crusade for freedom and human dignity. And so this afternoon, in a real sense, they have something to say to each of us in their deaths. They have something to say to every minister of the gospel who has remained silent behind the safe security of stained glass windows. They have something to say to each politician who has fed his constituency and his members with the stale bread of hatred and spoiled meat of racism. They have something to say to federal government that is compromised with the undemocratic practices of Southern Dixiecrats and the blatant hypocrisy of right-wing Northern Republicans. They have something to say to every Negro who has passively accepted the evil system of segregation and who has stood on the sidelines in a mighty struggle for justice. They say to each of us, black and white alike, that we must substitute courage for caution. They say to us that we must be concerned not merely about who murdered them, but about the system, the way of life, the philosophy which produced the murderers. Their deaths say to us that we must work passionately and unrelentingly for the realization of the American dream. And so, my friends, they did not die in vain. God still has a way of wringing good out of evil. And history has proven over and over again that unmerited suffering is redemptive. The innocent blood of these girls may well serve as a redemptive force that will bring new light to this dark city. The Holy Scripture says, a child shall lead them. The death of these little children may lead our whole southern land from the low roads of man's inhumanity to man to high road, the high road of peace and brotherhood. These tragic deaths may lead our nation to substitute an aristocratic sense of character and an aristocracy of color. The spoiled blood of these innocent girls may cause the whole citizenry of Birmingham to transform the negative extremes of a dark past into the positive extremes of a bright future. Indeed, this tragic event may cause the white South to come to terms with its conscience. And so, I stand here today to say this afternoon to all who are assembled here that in spite of the darkness of this hour, we must not despair. We must not become bitter, nor must we harbor the desire to retaliate with violence. No, we must not lose faith in our white brothers. Somehow we must believe that the most misguided among them can learn to respect the dignity and the worth of all human personality. May I now say a word to you, the members of the bereaved families. It's almost impossible to say anything that can console you at this difficult hour and remove the deep clouds of disappointment which are floating in your mental skies. But I hope you can find a little consolation from the universality of this experience. Death comes to every individual. There's an amazing democracy about death. It is not aristocratic or aristocracy for some of the people, but a democracy for all of the people. Kings die, beggars die. Rich men and poor men die. Old people die and young people die. Death comes to the innocent and it comes to the guilty. Death is the irreducible common denominator of all men. I hope you can find some consolation from Christianity's affirmation that death is not the end. Death is not a period that ends the great sentence of life, but a comma that punctuates it more loftily, and loftily as its significance. Death is not a blind ally that leads the human race into a state of nothingness, but an open door which leads man into a life eternal. Let this daring faith, this great invincible surmise, be your sustained power during these trying days. Now, I say to you in conclusion, life is hard. At times, it's hard as crucibled steel. It is bleak in this difficult moment. Life, the ever-flowing waters of the river, life has its moments of drought and its moments of flood. Like the ever-changing cycle of the seasons, life has the soothing warmth of its summers and the piercing chill of its winters. And if one will hold on, he will discover that God walks with him and that God is able to lift you from the fatigue of despair to the buoyancy of hope and transform dark and desolate valleys into sunlit paths of inner peace. And so today, you do not walk alone. You gave to this world wonderful children. They didn't live long lives, but they lived meaningful lives. Their lives were distressingly small in quantity, but glowingly large in quality. And no greater tribute can be paid to you as parents, and no greater epitaph can come to them as children than where they died and what they were doing when they died. They did not die in the dives and dens of Birmingham, nor did they die discussing and listening to filthy jokes. They died between the sacred walls of the Church of God, and they were discussing the eternal meaning of love. This stands out as a beautiful, beautiful thing for all generations. Shakespeare had Horatio to say some beautiful words as he stood over the body of Hamlet. And today, as I stand over the remains of these beautiful, darling girls, I paraphrase the words of Shakespeare. Good night, sweet princesses. Good night, those who symbolize a new day, and may the flight of angels take thee to the eternal rest. God bless you. In this eulogy, is it, in hearing those words, they're very, there was an urgency of now in the first piece, and there was this need for action in the second, and this one has another ring to it. Does anyone have a sense of what was its underpinning? What was it pushing us to do? What came up for you in that piece? In the back there? Okay. In the very far back. It's going to be a run for you. And she's off. As she does go up there to that point, I want you to think about what it says about turn the other cheek and love thy enemy, what that comes up for you.
What I got from that was basically to live, because at the end of the day, we are all going to die. And from, I think, the three speeches that were read out, one thing that he kept saying was, "Don't be bitter. Don't be bitter." So that kind of coincide with what you say about turning the other cheek, because that's not what we want to do. It's hard to not be bitter, especially when you see everything that's going on in the world and how people are being affected. But don't let your heart go hard. Love is what's going to lead us out the way.
How beautiful. Thank you for that. Thank you. That level of optimism and heartfelt acknowledgement of Dr. King's cornerstone of love and of forgiveness rings through what you just said, and I thank you for that. Any other comments that come up when you think about that phrase of love thy enemy or turn the other cheek, or any of the comments brought up in that last excerpt from the eulogy of the, how many, well, I don't know, there may not be many of you that were, well, I think the number of us, how many were around in 1963 when that happened? A good portion of us, yeah. And so, I remember I was an elementary school student that can remember quite vividly what happened in my family. My parents, my mother in particular, my mother and father went to Southern University in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and we were military kids, and so in '63, I think we were back in Los Angeles, and Los Angeles had just had the riots, and then they were having another one 3 years later. So there was a lot of fear and a lot of concern about the safety and the welfare of our children, and that our children are our richest seeds and our fertilest fields. And so in this instance, King reminds us of that of the importance of that and how valuable that is. Any other comments or thoughts about the last piece? Well, what I'd like to ask you before we come to a close is, do you think that Dr. King, given where we are today, what would he say to us? What do you think what he might be observing in our communities in such a way that, are we adhering and living out those words? What are we seeing, and what might his words to us be today? Would they be the same? Would they be different? Or do you want to add to that concept or that question? There in the back, on the back wall.
Good evening.
Good evening.
My name is Elias, and I've loved the whole event. First of all, let me say that it's a very good event for everyone, and I think we should try and get even more people to come to such events.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think the thing that Martin Luther would say, one of the first things that he will emphasize on is that about life not being easy, where he says life is hard. I think a lot of people nowadays want life to be easy and things to be easy and everything to be like, we feel like the fight is over because we have gotten most of the rights that we wanted, or our fathers or our forefathers were fighting for. I think a lot of people think that we have reached that point where everything is good and easy, because even like in a room like this one, I'll give an example, in a room like this one, you look at the majority of the people who are in here right now, where are all the black people? Where are all the people of color? You ask yourself that. These are the questions that we have to ask ourselves, and emphasize that the fight is not over. A lot of people, I think, have felt that the fight is over, and by fight, I don't mean like physical fight or like people will always think when someone says fight is like a physical fight, or it has to be like something that involves war. But I mean like the same fights that our forefathers like Martin Luther were fighting. I think that's something that people need to look into. And the final thing is about where he says the eulogy about the girls dying in a church. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of people have forgotten the church and have walked away from the church and have taken it for granted. And it's something very, very, very important in a community, and something that really, really, really helps build communities and bring people together. And most importantly, it brings love in the community. So when it brings that love is what helps people grow and helps people move forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Our mayor, Mayor Melvin Carter III, commented that the movement would not have been what it is or was were it not for the children, the young people, the college students. And I think that the departure from the church, had it not been for the church, there is no doubt the movement would not have existed. And that we have seen a shift in the number of congregants that are going to and are leaving churches. And I think that comment about love coming from a doctrine of whatever your religious or spiritual conviction might be, but knowing that love is at the essence. My great uncle lived to be 104, and when we asked him how he lived to be so old, he said, "Boy, air is good." And the breath inside the breath is where God and spirit exist, and where we're able to find a moment where we can find some unity and some cohesiveness in our communities. And my great aunt used to say, if the mountain was smooth, you couldn't climb it. And that's why it isn't easy, and you're right. If the mountain was smooth, you couldn't climb it. And that's the nature of our society today, wanting popcorn in 1.2 minutes in a microwave, getting a blink of an eye or a snap before we get a Snapchat. All of this immediate gratification is at the core of one of the other comments you made about wanting things easy. And so there's a lot of what you said that is something we need to consider and take a look at. So we thank you for those 3 comments that you made. Very good. Any other closing remarks? Yes. We're giving you your steps too, back and forth, up and down.
So it has gotten better from the 60s, but there is a lot that we still need to work on. And I feel like the number one thing is educating more people on people like Martin Luther King, because schools don't go in depth in it, as you guys all know. I had to research stuff on my own, just have a whole independent class on my own. So just have people have more awareness of it, and then they'll take more action. But it has improved from 60s, but there's still a lot of crappy things in the government. And I feel like he would say similar things, but as he did in the 60s.
Thank you. Thank you for commenting about one of the things that I took away from what you said, which is really powerful for me as a member of my generation and all the different varying generations and people here in this room, is going back to original sources and taking independent classes for ourselves, to immerse ourselves in information that we don't know, because what we hear and the sound bites we receive from USA Today, which is this much news, or from Facebook, or from various social media networks and platforms, that we need to really go back to listening and reading and giving ourselves permission to go further and deeper. So thank you for encouraging us to do that. We have 3 more comments. Yeah, we'll do all 3, and then we'll leave it at that. So we have my friend Stephanie. We go way back. I've known Stephanie, 40 minutes? No.
So another thing I was gonna mention, I do agree with her that the education, educating more people. Where I'm from, there's no such thing as races. There's classes, like clasistas. They don't difference people by the color. They difference people by the class, like high-end class, medium class, low class. I went to a private school, and I had my own chauffeur. I had my own maids. They lived in there. And we came here for the American dream, and now I clean my own dishes. And
good for you.
Right? But it surprised me when I got here, because my brother, we used to call him Negrito, and we love his color. And I was just telling him, my advisor, he say Negro 3 times, and it shocks me because when I came here, they told me, you can't use that word. And my brother is so dark-skinned that he tells me, you can't say that because you're not that dark. And for me, my husband is the whitest man in the world. He has red hair, but he tells me, yeah, he tells me, you have a thing for black people. And I do, because I love their skin color, and I'm the positive. I don't put black people low. I actually put them on a high stand. Like, I feel like they have more power, and I feel people here don't realize how much power with their color have. Like, I see my husband, and he can do many things that black people can do, and I love him, but I think I do have a thing for black people, and
Well, I want to thank you for that, and I want to make a few comments to what you're saying, just to not to necessarily cut you off, but to kind of take a shift in what I'm hearing, because I think it's important for us to recognize that your belief around classism and racism is a belief that you hold. I think there could be a number of us in the room that could argue the point around racism existing or not. I subscribe to the fact that racism is alive and well, and too well. But classism is certainly part of that strata that's very real. And I think your affinity for people that you admire and attribute characteristics and qualities to is something that's true for you. And I think that there are so many people who have very strong opinions about how that could be perceived. But the fact that you have such a positive perception, it makes me smile. Okay? We have one gentleman here behind you. He has the microphone.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. I just want to say something very short. Is just to say thank you for Dr. Martin Luther King. Thank you for why? I was thinking in a word that Dr. King said, dream. Dream. I remember my friends tell me, I told you I have a dream. Say, you believe in dreams? The dreams are not real. I don't believe that. Because now I believe, I live in the dream of Dr. Martin Luther King. Which is this dream? Today, it's a hard war. However, in which time of this war is an easy time for living? Always I have a difficult time. But the most important thing is how you're living with that. And Dr. King shows there is another way to living in this world, with love, with peace, and take out the fight. Many people say, Dr. King fight. No, Dr. King give love, show the pain for everybody. That one is the right way. I'm be happy because today I'm called the person, hey, good morning, Martin. Good morning, John. How are you, Thomas? Today I have names. In other times have, hey, black, hey, white, hey, yellow. That one is no names. I'm happy for that because today I live in the dream of Martin Luther King. We have names. We are people. Like Dr. King said, everybody die. Everybody have feelings. So it's just that. Thank you, Minister.
Thank you. Wow. You know, it's down here. I think we had, was it up there? Right down here, and this is our last one here. Thank you. Down there. As you're coming down there, you know, I think that your comment about his fight was really about love and living in the values of Dr. King today, and that the humanization of his dream and his message allows us to embrace each other as individuals, as whole beings. That was his thrust, and much of what he shared is that the universality of the human spirit exists in each person as a dynamic individual, a soul person with a beating heart and a loving affection. It's what sets us apart from animals, the loving affection. And so I think that that's part that you brought out about the love. So thank you for that.
Reflecting on the eulogy, What struck me about Dr. King's words was he didn't have to say that the people who perpetrated the crime were cowards, but that's what they were. He didn't have to say that the girls were angels, that's what they were. But he points out that people who commit those kinds of crimes, they really are cowards. And they thought they were doing something by getting rid of something that they didn't want. But in that very action, they flipped the narrative.
Mm-hmm.
They elevated the people they were trying to hurt. And so it's really, it's a conundrum.
Yeah.
And if you hold that in your heart, you realize that the people who have the most power are the people who are not inclined to hurt, not inclined to destroy, that are compassionate and all of those kinds of things. So.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you all for your comments, and thank you for kind of, as I kind of close here, could you give yourselves a round of applause real quickly, just for thanking you for holding in, it's being here with us. I think one of the takeaways from all of the remarks is the sense that we as a community have a job. We have something that we must do. And many of the comments from the students were the need for us to be active citizens in our communities, to represent the words and the life of Dr. King, in a way that gives them cause and purpose to step up to the plate as well. And one of the things that Dr. King said was that we may not remember the words of our enemies, but we will remember the silence of our friends. We can't be silent. We must continue to step up, step forward, and step out. And I think that that's one of the things I leave you with tonight, is the hope that you will not be silent, and that you will do. You can't do everything. James Baldwin says you can't change everything you face, but you can't change anything until you face it. It's time to face that we've got some work to do. And I think that each one of us, it's incumbent upon us, and it's our responsibility to be that force of action and be a change agent in our families, in our communities, in our schools, in our universities, in our states, cities, states, and in our nation, and on our planet. And so as you leave out today, make sure that when you encounter someone, see them. Truly see them. Acknowledge them. And if you aren't in a space where you feel like you want to engage them, offer them love and hope in a silent prayer. Because through those things, the message of King resonates and lives wholly and completely. So thank you again this evening. Please give a round of applause to Mr. Darius Dotch, Mr. MLK Sapp. I want to thank Shay. Where you is? There you is. All right, come on now. Maya Sullivan. We want to thank Aaron. And we want to thank Vanessa from Penumbra Theater. Once again, we are here today from Penumbra Theater Company, located in St. Paul in our fair city, Minnesota's only and longest standing African-American theater company. We thank you again. Have a beautiful rest of your evening.